WWE loves giants. Even now, as sports entertainment has evolved to place more emphasis on craftsmanship and athleticism over height and weight, if Vince McMahon sees someone standing the best part of 7 feet or more, he is going to be interested in seeing what they can do. We see it today with Commander Aziz and Omos, and so long as Vince McMahon is in charge, there will always be a place for giants on his show. Giants are special, and unless you work in the circus, you're not going to come across them too often. Seeing them do their thing in the squared circle is a true novelty, whether it's Andre, Big Show, or Great Khali dwarfing their opponents who, much of the time, aren't small blokes themselves. A giant will probably get more opportunities than those of normal proportions too, because they're a rare breed, and the belief for a long time was that bigger is better, and that the biggest of the boys draw money and attract interest. It doesn't always work out, however, and the bigger they are, sometimes the harder they fall. Size alone cannot guarantee success, of course, and many different things can result in someone who looks like they were made in a laboratory for the sole purpose of headlining pay-per-views not living up to their enormous potential, ending up as a giant failure. Oh, and before we get going, we've left Giant Gonzalez off this countdown on purpose because he was only signed to a year deal and was never intended to be a long-term signee. Plus, I'm fed up with talking about him in Countdown, so there you go. On with the list. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are 10 giants who failed in WWE. Join us. Number 10, Nathan Jones. Vince McMahon took one look at this Australian behemoth and saw a future WrestleMania main eventer in the making. Nathan Jones was a physical specimen, the likes of which you do not see every day, and better still, he had a built-in backstory that could be exploited as part of his wrestling persona. The Colossus of Boggo Road had spent time in an Australian prison for armed robbery before leaving and becoming a champion powerlifter. He tried his hand at MMA and then turned to wrestling, working on the indies and in Japan before being signed by WWE. His original Hannibal Lecter type character was nixed, and he was instead put with The Undertaker, positioned as the dead man's on-screen protege. He was brought up too soon, however, and was actually taken out of a planned tag bout at WrestleMania 19, though he did make it out for the finish before being sent to OVW for further training. He returned months later as a heel aligned with Paul Heyman and fellow freaks of nature Big Show, A-Train, Matt Morgan, and Brock Lesnar. Before it could take off, however, Jones abruptly quit the company while on tour in his home country, citing the relentless travel schedule and mental stress caused by the cutthroat backstage politics. Number 9, Matt Morgan. Jones's brief stablemate, Matt Morgan, was another mid-2000s meathead fresh off the assembly line and ready to take on the world. Morgan was a contestant on the second series of Tough Enough, but had to leave partway through due to injury. WWE signed him to a developmental deal anyway, and he reported to OVW, where he became a favorite of Booker Jim Cornette. The Blueprint, as he was known, was brought up to SmackDown and put with the other brutes in a short main event run before being sent back to Kentucky in order to gain seasoning. He toiled away for the next year, improving his game and waiting for his big break to arrive. When he did get the call to come back to the main roster, the creative sucked a big fat one. The big man was given the role of Carlito's stuttering bodyguard. He inherited Lesnar's old F5 finisher, but otherwise did nothing of note before Carlito was drafted to Raw, and Morgan was subsequently released after just a couple of months on TV. And he hasn't been back since, instead opting to make a home for himself in TNA, where he became a reliable worker and often flirted with the world title scene. Number 8, Giant Silver. Giant Silver's massive frame meant that the big man could do many things in his native Brazil. He could stack the tallest shelves at the supermarket, he could help get cats out of trees, or he could play basketball. He chose the latter and excelled, even playing for the national team at the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul. He turned to wrestling and was signed by WWE in 1997, debuting as a member of the Oddities in the spring of '98. His inexperience meant that he was kept out of the ring and relegated to dancing at ringside, but he did step inside the squared circle in an 8-man tag bout at SummerSlam, beating Kai and Tai in a bizarre but fun handicap match. During the contest, Jim Ross likened Silver to Andre the Giant on commentary, and it was clear that the organization expected a lot from the 7+ footer. However, in February of 1999, WWE snatched Paul White away from WCW, and Silver was sent off to Mexico as part of a talent exchange deal with CMLL before being given his release papers shortly thereafter. Happily, he enjoyed much success south of the border and then in the Far East, where he both wrestled and competed in MMA. day. Number 7, Kergan. Giant Silver's oddities pal Kergan had a lot of potential and was probably somebody that WWE would have done a great deal more with had he shown a better aptitude for the business. He was experienced by the time he came to WWE in 1997, having previously had a tryout in 91 and had wrestled around the world, including stints in Mexico and Japan. He'd been out of the game and bouncing at local bars for a few years when he decided to give it another shot, the Canadian getting rid of any ring rust by training with Bret Hart at the Hitman's house. His first WWE role was as South African mercenary the Interrogator in the Truth Commission faction, which ran its course before long. After catching him dancing at the WrestleMania 14 afterparty, Vince McMahon was transfixed and put him with the oddities. Kergan ended up becoming a beloved fan favorite during one of WWE's hottest periods, but the group had a short shelf life and fizzled out quickly. He was let go by WWE, and it was thought for a while that he would go back, but it wasn't to be, and he hung up his massive boots, instead turning his attention to another industry. These days, the big man is a hot commodity in Hollywood and has had many memorable roles in some big blockbuster films. I mean, it might not compare with dancing to the Insane Clown Posse with John Tenter in a Cartman t-shirt, but you know, it pays the bills, I guess. Number 6, Gene Snitsky. Why didn't Gene Snitsky make it to the top of WWE? I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that it wasn't his fault! Developmental prospect Snitsky practically lucked into his featured role and feud with Kane, which came about as a result of a rather distasteful angle where the big man caused the Big Red Machine to fall on Lita, resulting in her storyline miscarriage. The Kane feud proved to be an early peak, as from there Gene bounced around as something of a utility monster of the week with a foot fetish, before floundering in makeshift tag teams with the likes of Tyson Tomko and Goldust. In an attempt to revive his career, he underwent a drastic physical transformation, shaving off all of his hair, including the eyebrows, and colouring his teeth a dark yellow. This, coupled with his all-over body acne, the result of allergies and not his choice of certain pharmaceutical products, I'm sure, made him look positively grotesque. He enjoyed a renewed push, first on the revamped ECW brand and then back on Raw, but WWE never pulled the trigger proper, and Snitsky was given his release in late 2008. He left on good terms, though expressed frustration with how he was being used at the end of his run. Number 5, Luther Reigns. Look at this big chiseled bastard right here. Tall, jacked, looks good in a suit, surname Reigns. How was this guy not main eventing every WrestleMania as WWE champion? I will never know. A graduate of the WCW power plant, Reigns worked as horseshoe for the promotion before doing the indie thing and eventually getting signed to a WWE developmental deal in 2003. He debuted as general manager Kurt Angle's bodyguard/assistant in April 2004 and debuted in the ring at the disastrous Great American Bash pay-per-view, beating Charlie Haas. Though obviously greener than the Incredible Hulk eating broccoli on a football pitch, Luther got better over time under the guidance of the Olympic hero, whom he often tagged with. He also teamed with another hot prospect, Mark Jindrak, the two sensibly paired up against solid veterans like Rey Mysterio, Rob Van Dam, Big Show, and Eddie Guerrero. The litmus test for Reigns was probably in his big singles match with The Undertaker at No Way Out 2005, a test he must have failed, because it wasn't too long after that he began to slide down the card and ended up wrestling exclusively on Velocity. After having creative differences with Paul Heyman, he negotiated his release and practically disappeared from the business. Number 4, Big Cass. Big Cass is 7 feet tall, and obviously you can't teach that, but you can teach somebody psychology, timing, selling, verbal delivery, and all of the other things that are required to become a major player. Cass, who bears a striking resemblance to Test, struck gold in his tag team with Enzo Amore, the little and large duo captivating the NXT audience and earning themselves a call-up to the main roster. With their undeniable chemistry, abundant charisma, merchandise-friendly catchphrases, and in-ring tag formula down to a science, the pair should have been a staple for years and years to come, the perfect house show opening act if there ever was one. Naturally, WWE saw singles stardom in the Seven Footers' future, splitting up the team before they were really ready to go their separate ways, and giving Cass the big push in programs with Big Show and Daniel Bryan. Regrettably, all was not well behind the curtain, and Cass was fired due to his unpredictable behavior stemming from substance abuse issues. While Cass disappeared the first time round, there is every hope that he will find his way back to WWE in the future. He's cleaned his act up, got into into shape that will surely turn Vince McMahon's head, and still in his mid-30s, has many great years ahead of him. We are all rooting for you, Cass. Number 3, Tyson Tomko. Appearing on television around the same time as Luther Reigns and put in a similar role, Tyson Tomko also very much looked the part with his cut physique, devilish beard, and plentiful tattoos. I mean, he just screams ruthless aggression, doesn't he? Recruited as Christian and Trish Stratus's problem solver, i.e. a big bloke hired to twat their enemies about, Tomko basically had to stand there in a tank top and act menacing while delivering the occasional power move, something he did very well. The dynamic worked wonders, even more so when Stratus left the picture and Tomko got some much needed ring time in tag bouts with Captain Charisma. When Christian was switched over to SmackDown in the 2005 draft, however, Tomko was forced to go solo. He got the requisite monster heel push, knocking out jobbers and lower card fodder with his big boot, before getting fed 2 weeks in a row to John Cena, which seemed to indicate that WWE didn't really have any grand plans for him. After that, they paired him up with Gene Snitsky, but the team wrestled mostly on heat and house shows, and not content with his lot, Tomko requested and was granted his release in April of 2006. Following strong runs in Japan and for TNA, WWE actually hired Tomko back a couple of years later, but released him again months later before he could make an appearance on TV. Number 2, Bam Neely. Oh good, here we go again. Look, I've already talked about Bam Neely in one video already, isn't that enough? There's nothing to say, there's nothing here. He was just a big bald bloke called Bam. He was mates with Chavo Guerrero and found himself rubbing shoulders with Edge and Vicky Guerrero in the La Familia stable on SmackDown in 2008. I think he wrestled some matches too, but I can't be sure and I'm not gonna bother checking because it's Bam Neely we're talking about here. The one thing he did have going for him was his size, and he couldn't even really do that properly because he didn't look threatening at all. Was he even a trained wrestler, or did Chavito just bump into him while he was working doors at a nightclub and drunkenly offer him a spot on the show? It's as good an explanation as any I can think of, honestly, because I can't see WWE management watching him in whatever developmental territory they had at the time and saying, "We've got to get Bam Neely on TV right this second." For most of the giants on this list, you can possibly point to bad luck, unfavorable creative, or some other circumstance as to why they didn't make it. But when it comes to Bam Neely, there's only one reason he failed, and that is because he's Bam Neely. Number 1, Jackson Andrews. Blink and you'll miss him is not something you often say about 7-footers, but the WWE career of Jackson Andrews was so fleeting that there's every chance you've either never heard of him, or if you have, that he's long left your mind. Stephen Slocum was a decent enough basketball player, having played professionally in Europe upon leaving university, before returning to the US and trying his hand at this wrestling thing. After just a couple of years worth of training, WWE snapped him up in 2009 and assigned him to Florida Championship Wrestling. After a year of bumping away in the Sunshine State, WWE called him up to the main roster as the bodyguard of Tyson Kidd. This was a good role for Andrews, as he could play the imposing enforcer a la Diesel to Kidd's cocky and talented Shawn Michaels. Jackson attacked Tyson's former tag partner David Hart Smith and was dropped by Mark Henry with a World's Strongest Slam a couple of weeks later, and, well, that was it. It was decided, as it so often is, that he wasn't ready and needed more time to develop. He didn't get it though, being released from his contract and, you guessed it, vanishing from the business thereafter. You may be big, Jackson, but you sure as hell ain't big sexy.